Hey guys, right before we get into the video, I have a quick disclaimer. I played Uncharted 2 in December of 2020, so over a year ago. However, I didn't actually write the script for this video until about April 2021, which was still a long time ago, after which I more or less immediately recorded the initial audio for the review. However, as is obvious now, that video and a few things that I said in it are a little outdated. For example, I said in various places about it being 4 or 5 months since I played the game, and maybe a couple other random things like that. Now it has been around 14 months since I played the game, so take some of those things into consideration as the video goes on. If there's any weird timeline inconsistencies in the recording, that's why. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy, and now back to the video. I'm admittedly nervous to actually finish recording my thoughts on this game, let alone put out a video of those thoughts for the entire world to have access to. This minor anxiety is only exasperated by the fact that I've been so out of touch with writing for so long, but I'll give this the best shot that I can. Before you all grab your pitchforks and torches and raid my figurative home in discontent, give me an opportunity and a few minutes of your time to explain not only how I feel about Uncharted 2, but also why I feel that way. Trust me, it's a bit more complicated than the thumbnail may have led you to believe. There's a lot to love about Among Thieves. Many people consider it to be the best of the original Uncharted trilogy, and there are obviously some very good reasons as to why. Trust me, I do not completely hate this game. In fact, many of the reasons this game is so beloved to so many are things that I wholeheartedly agree with. Yet, the gripes that I did have with it were strong enough that they completely soured my total overall experience, leaving the forefront memories of this game in my mind to be the worst ones. After I reviewed the first game, I fully expected Uncharted 2 to just utterly knock my socks off, and given that it objectively improved upon its predecessor in plenty of ways, even if just a little bit, it's still a mystery to me why I am in the position I am today regarding my feelings towards the game. Whether for better or for worse, I wonder now if my initial expectations had an adverse effect on how I would ultimately feel about the game in the end. I guess I'll never know for sure, but now I guess I am finally ready to present to you Uncharted 2: Among Thieves, a critical analysis. Drake's Fortune was a game that existed and succeeded quite well as a proof of concept, due to relatively impressive graphics that reached for realism at the time, a story that felt compelling despite its simplicity and occasional predictability, and most especially incredible character writing and humor that kept the game fresh even during its blandest gameplay sections. The first game in this series had a charm to it that hooked countless players, and the second game sought to do nothing but deliver that experience again with a newer, more compelling narrative and coat of paint. Nathan Drake shines as the protagonist, as always. He was fantastic in the first, he is somehow even better here in Among Thieves. The writing of his character, especially when given a companion to banter with, is just exquisite. I never found myself disappointed in the dialogue of the characters or questioning the motivations or desires of them, just as I felt during Drake's Fortune. Additionally, the premise and tone are designed specifically to deliver a comical experience without it feeling forced or like it's too much. Nolan North's performance as Nathan Drake also couldn't be done any better in my opinion. Sorry, Tom Holland, I just haven't seen you on screen yet. In fact, the performances overall are improved enough in general that when the gameplay starts to get in the way of the enjoyment, more on that later, I would still say Among Thieves is worth playing for the characterization, interpersonal dialogue, and character development. The story and its construction is better as well. Just as Drake's Fortune chose to lean into the unrealistic side of things with its storytelling, particularly near the end, Among Thieves also chooses to use legend to its advantage in incorporating events, settings, and enemies that otherwise would not exist. Besides, the way legend is incorporated in Among Thieves is just an objectively improved format. As I mentioned in my review of Drake's Fortune, the supernatural-esque inclusions of the game almost felt ham-fisted into the experience in a way that really made it feel like just as much a proof of concept in storytelling as in gameplay. I personally didn't find it to be anything to complain about, but the word forced wouldn't be too far off from being a relevant or applicable description of how well it worked. Almost like it came out of nowhere because the writers didn't have anywhere better to take it that they felt totally comfortable with. Just a quick side note, I know it seems ironic that I say this about Drake's Fortune when I also said in that game's review that the twist also didn't really seem like a twist because it was generic and predictable. The reason that I think the twist was both unexpected and ham-fisted in from my perspective is because by 2020, that style of twist was a done, redone, and overdone format. I knew that something was going to change the game's experience in some manner like how it happened, but I was unsure of the specifics of the twist. Similarly, due to how little headroom the twist's concept was given in terms of foreshadowing and whatnot, it also seemed somehow even more out of the blue than it already did. Despite this, the legends in the sequel feel much more fully melded into the identity of the entire game. In Drake's Fortune, El Dorado being made into a golden statue was a fun twist on the traditional legend of the Golden City, but the curse associated with it wasn't even really introduced into the concept of the game until about 2/3 of the way into it when it was revealed, which only worsened how naturally it initially fit into the concept. It felt ham-fisted specifically because of how out of nowhere it felt at first. Conversely, from the start, Among Thieves takes a very different approach by incorporating the legend of Shambhala and the implications of its existence basically right from the very start, establishing that the game's story is going to twist with some technically unrealistic things later. This early expectation of the weird and wacky, as well as the anticipation of what the mythical substance is in the Lost Civilization, worked well together with the familiarity of legend from the first game to build an intrigue and interest that the original failed to carry. Where Drake's Fortune could potentially play a role in turning players off to the concept, Among Thieves led players to expect and more openly embrace those very same types of topics. Among Thieves just takes a step back, looks at what worked and what didn't from the first game, and uses that information to craft something more fully realized, which plays a big role in helping it all feel cohesive, purposeful, and more natural, even when things get unnatural. One of the things I criticized about Drake's Fortune the most was how janky some of the platforming and controls could be at times. It wasn't often very bad, but there were definitely plenty of times that I felt frustrated with the controls, and especially when camera angles definitely made the gameplay experience significantly harder or more aggravating than it needed to be. As such, I was hoping that Among Thieves would confront some of those issues for me and provide a better gameplay experience. Did I get what I wanted on that front? Well, yes, but actually no. It's a little complicated. First of all, camera angle issues were not fixed, and whatever else I was hoping would be improved wasn't exactly improved by a significant, really noticeable margin. But I did notice that the jankiness was mostly gone, a product of better world building, I assume. There were still many instances where I would die or leave myself exposed or something along those lines because of technical issues with the controls, but it generally didn't break my experience entirely. I did notice that the crouching and ducking behind cover controls are pretty bad though. Most of the time it felt like those things just didn't work at all for me, and when they did, it would read in places or spots that I didn't want it to, oftentimes leaving me in vulnerable positions that were either very difficult or impossible to get myself out of before dying. By 4 or so hours in, I just completely stopped ducking behind cover and crouching entirely except where necessary, because it didn't work well enough for me and I was over dealing with crouching frustrations. Part of the problem with this that I explicitly noticed was that a game like Uncharted needs a dedicated crouching button. The only way to crouch is to be next to cover, and the button you use to duck behind that cover, if I remember correctly, is the same as the roll button, which can cause some problems with reading what the player is trying to do versus what actually happens. I am certain that if the Uncharted games had a more typical or traditionally dedicated crouch option that could be activated or used anytime outside of being by cover as well, that this issue would have been solved, like, completely. However, aside from this point, I've gotta say the gameplay didn't change too much. I'm comfortable saying that for the most part, the actual process of playing through Among Thieves most of the time was very similar to Drake's Fortune. As they say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and I see why this design philosophy was applied as it was here. My general consensus is that controls and gameplay were overall pretty much the same, with slight polish. I ensure that this section isn't meant to act as me taking a massive dump on this entire game, but I will admit ahead of time that it may seem like it. If you saw the thumbnail to this video and that's what made you decide to click on it, I don't mean to offend anyone with any of this section. I am very aware of the praise that this title gets, and I am also very aware that what I'm about to say is incredibly bold and goes against the common opinion of the internet, but hear me out. This section will explain the things about this game that got under my skin a little bit, and give personal evidence as to why I personally got so tilted at this game the way that I did, despite wanting to like it as much as everybody else does. Gameplay controls were the primary gameplay elements that I had no issue with in this game. They were basically the same as the first game, and they worked well for what they are aside from a thing or two here or there. Again, just as the first game. My real issues with this, though, came with the rest of the gameplay, primarily in combat-related situations. Enemies in this game are unnecessarily tanky. Only a few chapters in, you're already fighting heavily armored enemies that are pretty difficult to get rid of. In general, the difficulty curve of the combat is the main game-encompassing problem I had. Instead of being eased into more and more difficult enemy types with unique buffs and weaknesses over time, the game shoots from a 2 or 3 on the difficulty scale in the initial chapters to a 6 or 7 or so, relatively speaking of course, in a matter of minutes out of nowhere, and it doesn't get easier after that. It holds at that difficulty, if not increasing to be worse, depending on the enemy type and chapter for the rest of the entire game. This problem would not be nearly so bad if there was some type of armor or gear system to the game like in RPGs that directly contributed to your survivability. But Uncharted games are, in fact, not RPGs and don't feature any form of upgrading gear aside from weapons more or less getting stronger, kind of. Due to this fact, the difficulty curve of enemy encounters feels extremely unbalanced and unfun much of the time. Getting through some chapters and encounters almost feels grindy and painful because of how unbalanced enemies are in relativity to you. And mind you, I played this on normal difficulty, and I still noticed. Furthermore, even just on normal difficulty, most enemies could kill me faster than I had a chance to react. The accuracy and persistence of enemy attacks is just constant, relentless even. This was an issue that I never had or noticed in the first game, let alone bad enough to comment on. Outside of an unbalanced and aggravating difficulty curve that felt like hitting a solid wall of Gorilla Glue that was impossible to unattach myself from, there were some sections and encounters that were just poorly constructed in the first place, by design. I suppose now is your ever so minor visual spoiler warning in case you happen to be the 1 in a million people who hasn't played or seen a playthrough of this game yet, since I'll be discussing and showing some mid-game and late-game encounters here. One major section of note was the combination of chapters 22 and 23, which were extremely long and tedious, filled with little to nothing except combat, more combat, and you guessed it, a little bit more combat mixed in. This monotony was annoying enough in and of itself, but the settings of these chapters and the way that enemies are placed was horrible for me. I won't rant too much about this section specifically, but there was a lot in these 2 chapters that could have and should have been trimmed down and balanced better, just because of the sheer aggravation that came with them. One spot in particular is where you climb up to the top of a certain tower or something, and you have to take out like 1 rocket guy and I believe it was 5 snipers. This section was awful. A little bit of this is my own fault for not realizing that there was an enemy with a rocket launcher in the same approximate location as the snipers and wondering why the heck I was getting destroyed by explosions so many times. But when the game gives you red laser pointers from snipers to focus on and virtually no way to be able to see where the rockets are coming from without trial and error because they're so far away, the distraction and lack of clarity meant I died at least a dozen or more times to the rocket guy alone before I even realized he was there and found him, despite moving around and rolling away from shots constantly. It was absolutely stupid. Honestly though, I will say that a lot of the combat encounters in these later chapters in general were way more difficult than they needed to be. Like I mentioned earlier, the difficulty of combat section spikes early on and just continues to get worse throughout the game. So by this point, it's just a real big pain in the butt to take care of enemies in any way in the first place, especially given the restriction of only 1 sidearm and 1 larger weapon. If you could hold even just a second of each weapon type, this problem wouldn't be nearly so bad because then I could just keep a rocket launcher of my own or sniper of my own equipped as my backup heavy weapon and all would be more or less fine and dandy. But this isn't the case, so the late game just feels like a complete and total slog to get through most of the time. Outside of this story, of course, which was an absolute treat at this point and basically the only reason I continued to play. But what also was just kind of a not fun experience was at the end of the game, particularly with the final boss. This encounter wasn't necessarily bad or exceptionally difficult, but it was definitely nowhere near as satisfying as the final boss of Drake's Fortune. Navarro in that game, being a somewhat surprise villain, was cold and calculating, waiting for the exact moment to reveal himself, and his fight was fun with creative and interesting design, most notably the boxes you cover behind, and especially the way that those boxes break after sustaining enough gunfire, which made the process of taking out the henchmen while avoiding the onslaught of attacks an absolute joy to do. And among Thieves, Lazarevich is just a damage sponge. The only way to defeat him is basically run in circles and turning around periodically in some sections and shooting the resin when he's near them, and hoping the explosions happen to catch him, and also hoping the entire time that you don't make a small mistake while running circles that will cause him to just kill you and reset the encounter. Since he takes so many explosions to kill, it's just such a long, tedious, and I guess somehow stressfully boring encounter that makes you just wish it would finally end already after each explosion you cause. Such a poorly designed boss fight after Navarro was so enjoyable. However, my absolute biggest gripe with this game began near the end of chapter 12 when Nathan is trying to reach the train to save Chloe. In the overturned train car, this encounter is surprisingly difficult. I mean, it makes sense since this area is kind of an enemy stronghold in a way, but without knowing how to do this section beforehand, I'd predict that 99% of first timers died here at least once, if not more than that. Like, most likely more than that. Learning through trial and error in difficult situations isn't a bad thing at all, just look at Dark Souls, that's how it made its success. But in a game like Uncharted, where difficulty isn't exactly the typical talking point, having a section where basically every player is going to die the first time, if not several times or more, until they learn the exact way they have to deal with that section is a pretty poorly designed decision, if not a really poor design decision. And we're still not done. When you do manage to pass this encounter, chapter 13, chapter 13, boy do I have a bone to pick with you. I don't know if I have the patience to talk about this chapter yet. Even after like 4 or 5 months or however long ago it was that I played this game, this chapter is the bane of my existence. I don't know if I can really articulate with the English language what it is about this chapter exactly that gets on my nerves. But what I can do is give you context to some of the things about this chapter that tilted me so bad. Firstly, it's just the fact that this train is so obscenely long. The amount of train cars on this thing is astoundingly horrific. It provides for many different gameplay obstacles and variations, sure, but at the cost of this section becoming a huge, frustrating mess. Plus, again, bringing up the broken difficulty curve, the enemies are really difficult. And this chopper thing here, thrown in the middle of the chapter for no reason, is absolutely OP. The first time you see one is in like the first 5 chapters or something, which is absolutely horrible gameplay pacing since it just melts you instantly no matter what. And let me tell you what, a confined train with limited ways to avoid this thing is much, much harder than confined rooftops with limited ways to avoid this thing. It just sucks. And then eventually, you come to a section with this mini-boss kind of guy close to the front, which is, thank goodness, the last real major hiccup and challenge on this train, with the rest of it being relatively manageable. This guy sucks. I would genuinely swear this guy is impossible on the crushing difficulty, let alone the brutal difficulty if it weren't for people like Gerard the Completionist who have done that before. I can't even comprehend that. I played on normal and had to switch to easy to do this part, and even then I barely did it, and I know that it was only because I got lucky. Admittedly, I could have just been going about this encounter poorly, but when you're on a single train car, I can't even really fathom any other way of doing it. And for reference, I tried this section again. Because of having to switch to easy to complete this chapter, I didn't get the trophy at the end of the game indicating that I had completed the whole thing on normal. So you know what I did? I tried again. A few days after completing the game, I specifically dedicated the time to replay the game, making a specific point to not switch to easy, just so that I could have a normal difficulty context run for this review. You wanna know how it turned out? I didn't finish. I got to this guy on the train again, and I didn't do it. I tried for probably an hour, doing anything and everything I could to get past this guy. I have absolutely no idea what in the world it is that I'm doing wrong, but the fact that I now knew what to expect and mentally prepared myself to do it with as much patience as I could possibly muster, plus the fact that I put in a pretty unreasonable amount of time and effort to overcome this obstacle and it still managed to make me rage quit, just makes me think about how poorly designed this encounter was. Maybe I'm the one doing it wrong. Maybe I'm not. I don't know. I just know that this review is based on my personal experience with the game, and in my experience, this chapter ruined it for me. If there's an explicitly easier way to do this part, somebody please tell me, because I would genuinely love to know. And if I hadn't been recording this for a Let's Play, I would have quit. It took me so long and caused me so much frustration. I legitimately did not think it was worth playing, even for the story, even on easy. This chapter was that bad. Like, I should not be playing a game on easy, unabashedly admitting that I was playing on easy, and still feel like the game difficulty and balancing is broken. Anyways, I'm gonna stop here before I get any more upsetty spaghetti. I really hope you are able to understand by now why I got as tilted as I did at this game. Besides, even as earlier examples suggested, Chapter 13 was not the last time I felt like quitting the game, despite wanting more of the story. Besides, I'm generally a more story-forward gamer who can deal with mediocre or even sometimes bad gameplay if the story's good enough. But somehow this crossed the line for me. Big time. If I was somebody who valued gameplay just as much as or even more than a great story, I would have dropped this game at Chapter 13 and never come back to it. Believe me, that's something I absolutely hate saying, but that's my honest opinion. If you clicked on this video wondering how on earth I could possibly not like one of the most critically acclaimed games of the generation, I hope you have your answer by now. I haven't talked much about the story yet, but the general gist of it is that this game was one I hated, but this story was one good enough that I pushed through torture to experience in its intended format. Naughty Dog's games for the past decade and a half for the most part have all been well regarded as having incredibly written characters and a good story, and this very much holds true for Uncharted 2. Nathan's quips are better than in the first game, his relationships with other characters are more carefully and successfully crafted than before due to us being familiar already with several faces, the plot elements themselves are more naturally weaved into the fabric of the product, and the overall package story was one I admittedly commend greatly. I now fully understand the claim behind this game because of the story. It isn't any The Last of Us, but it's still incredibly good. I've already said this, but the fact that the story itself was enough to make me push through how much I hated actually playing parts of this game is a testament to its quality, because anything less than this level of writing would not have had that effect for me. My general consensus on this game is still pretty complicated though. As a game, I can't say I enjoyed Among Thieves much at all, but for the story alone, I'd still say it's worth a play, I guess. I don't know if it was just me, but it almost kind of seems like most other people did not have nearly the amount of issues I did while playing Uncharted 2. So if you are somebody who hasn't played it, you can go ahead and do so. It's likely just me being stupid to cause these issues, but be warned that you could potentially have a mediocre or even terrible experience just because of a few sections. You can make your own decision based on what I've said, I guess, because I honestly don't have a straight answer for whether I recommend this package or not in total. If you decide not to play, I at least recommend watching cutscene movies here on YouTube. And disclaimer, I still look forward to playing Drake's Deception and eventually A Thief's End, but I'd be lying if I said Among Thieves didn't leave a bad taste in my mouth. If you still think I'm wrong and you disrespect my opinion, you may now dislike the video. It definitely wasn't for a lack of effort though. Thank you guys for sticking around to this point in the video if you did. I would greatly appreciate it if you drop it a like and give me a sub if you enjoyed. Stay safe guys, and I'll be back again in the next one.